Has humanity's relationship with the Halo array changed over time? In some ways, yes, it has. During the closing days of the war, Halos were terrifying. They were weapons of immeasurable destruction. They held terrible things on them, like the Flood, and the Covenant wanted to use them. After the war, however, things changed in some ways. Without the Covenant wanting to use them, there was no longer this race to the control room that we got so used to on Alpha Halo and Delta Halo. When humanity found a new Halo, we could take our time studying it, mostly Installation 07 and Installation 03, to be precise. These were vast Forerunner research stations, basically, where humans could comb through them, learning about the Forerunners, finding their technologies, and studying those technologies to implement them into the fleet. We also worked on making them less dangerous. The Infinity's mission before Requiem was to find and decommission the remaining Halos. They do this by taking the activation index, but of course, they didn't get all of them, and there are still enemies in the galaxy ready and willing to use Halos, like the Keepers of the One Freedom, who once sought to do just that. And of course, on Zeta Halo, a big goal of the Banished was to make the ring operational again after Cortana damaged it. So they're still immensely dangerous, but they're also storehouses of vast knowledge. Did the Covenant have their own AIs? Yes, they did. But they weren't like human AIs, and they may have even been human AIs, and they were pretty rare. First off, it's important to mention that the most common form of AI for the Covenant were the engineers. Now, I know these aren't like AIs that we're used to seeing, but they kind of are. They're artificial, they are built, not born, and they can manipulate code just like an AI. They also had AIs that would be a lot more like dumb human AIs rather than smart human AIs, but still way dialed down. Human dumb AIs are still marvels of technology. However, Covenant AIs are like Alexa with smart appliances. They can turn things on and off, they can help pilot a ship, but they're not going to be giving you advice. They're not going to be helping the crew outside of very basic functions. This is because the Covenant's religion forbade the creation of advanced thinking machines, and the Covenant AIs may have even been captured and tortured human AIs. But that's outside the scope of this video. We'll leave that for another day. Really, there are only two examples I can think of a Covenant AI that doesn't include mendicant bias. There is one in the Halo CE terminals, and there's one on the Ascendant Justice that tries to interfere with Cortana when the Chief and a few Alpha Halo survivors are trying to take over the ship. This interaction really shows the difference between a Covenant and human AI. Cortana pretty effortlessly captures, and for lack of a better term, kills this AI after taunting it for a little bit. What was the difference between Operation Torpedo and Operation Prometheus? That is a fantastic question. Operation Prometheus was the mission that 300 Spartan 3s of Alpha Company were sent on. This was on an asteroid called K7-49 that housed a Covenant shipyard. Here, the Spartans destroyed 20 Covenant reactors that crippled the ship-making operations. Unfortunately, after several counterattacks, the elites gained the upper hand, cut off the Spartans from their escape craft, and all 300 were killed. Operation Torpedo was a similar mission carried out by 300 Spartans of Beta Company. This one was on a planet called Pegasi Delta. This mission was to take out a Covenant fuel refinery. Namely, they refined deuterium and tritium, the two substances used in Covenant pinch fusion reactors. Here, the Spartans were successful in crippling the Covenant's refinery, but suffered severe casualties while doing so. Then, unfortunately, 7 Covenant ships dropped from orbit, deploying thousands of Covenant troops that proceeded to slaughter Beta Company. 2 Spartans, Tom and Lucy, were able to escape by jumping off of a cliff into water below, shielding them from an explosion from the refinery. They made their way to their escape craft and left. These 2 missions were massive successes to the UNSC and significantly hindered the Covenant's advance into human space. Unfortunately, it cost basically the entire Spartan 3 program at that time, other than a few exceptions. Would Alpha 9 have been successful in their mission if Veronica Dare didn't show up? Absolutely not. For those of you who may not know, the original plan for all the ODSTs at the beginning of Halo 3 ODST was to drop directly into the Covenant ship that slipped past the orbital defenses, the Solemn Penance, the ship from Halo 2, and neutralize it from the inside. The problem, of course, as we all know, is that the Solemn Penance jumps into slip space as the ODSTs are making their drop towards the ship, completely making this mission impossible. If they successfully made their way into the Solemn Penance, they'd enjoy 2 weeks of fierce combat inside the Covenant ship. Now, ODSTs are good, but without an AI helping, without mapping their way, without shutting down passages, without venting atmosphere, they would likely be killed. If they got close to the ship as it jumped, there would be 2 options. They'd be sucked into slip space, where they would sit in their drop pods and slowly suffocate, or they'd be caught in the subsequent explosion and would be killed. Now, I clown on Dare all the time for being a bad leader, poor decision maker, and an abysmal communicator. But had she not redirected the ODSTs at the last moment, Alpha 9 would likely have been killed. Unfortunately, it also scattered the team around the city with absolutely no idea what their mission actually was. Again, abysmal communicator. While Sergeant Johnson fails a lot in the games, he does do amazing things during the war. As we all know, he was basically the first human to fight and kill Covenant soldiers, and as such, he was brought in to advise the Spartans. Literally. When the Spartans became the only effective means of fighting the Covenant, they brought in Johnson to sort of act as a mediator between the Spartans and the ODSTs that they'd be working with. Johnson was also a great help to the Master Chief himself. He was able to expertly navigate the internal politics of the UNSC, things that the Spartans really hadn't been trained on. He helped John through these awkward situations and even helped him navigate between 2 commanding officers, one being really nice to the Spartans, advocating for them to be on the front lines, leading the charge, and one, in John's eyes, being unnecessarily cautious, having the Spartans sit back. As it turns out, the nice one was an insurrectionist and was putting the Spartans on the front line in hopes that they would be killed. Johnson was also there when the Master Chief was promoted to that rank, Master Chief. Unfortunately, however, after this series of missions in a book called Silent Storm, Johnson is pretty much unheard of until the Master Chief rescues him on Gamma Station on Reach just before Halo CE. There's a whole lot more in that book that he does, so you should absolutely go read it. Faster than light communications are some of the most important innovations in human history. Before the end of the war, the fastest way to send a message was to send a ship through slipspace with that message, or use something called a slipspace comm launcher, which was an underground Mac cannon that shot a cannonball-sized probe into the sky, out of atmosphere, and into slipspace, where it traveled to where it needed to be. But they were super expensive pieces of machinery, and only 2 had been officially made, one on Earth and one on Reach. However, there was a secret one on Onyx. Now, after the war, there was a shield world where Onyx used to be called Trevelyan. Here, UNSC finds a wealth of Forerunner technologies, but the most important one were Forerunner original engineers. This is significant for a number of reasons, but one of the most revolutionary things that they were able to improve were our communications. They made it so that we could communicate vast distances instantaneously, which is how things like this can happen. A conversation like this would be impossible during the war, leaving ships to deal with things on their own a lot of the time. Engineers also made it possible to communicate into and out of slipspace, so you could get real-time battle information while in slipspace before you dropped out for that battle. This is, again, a revolutionary innovation. What are the Hellbringers and what have they done? It's a fantastic question, but unfortunately, we are just lacking in information here. Hellbringers are a somewhat rare sect of ODSTs that burn and blow stuff up. That's pretty much it. They are most known for being the flamethrower guys, but they also were trained in chemical weapons as well as the use of nuclear weapons, or at least small nuclear weapons. But again, this would be somewhat rare. Most often, they were deployed in 2-man teams with special liquid-fueled flame projectors that made them uniquely useful against the Covenant and the Flood. Specifically on the Spirit of Fire, however, some form of cryogenic weapons were developed and the Hellbringers would use those as well. They were special flame-retardant armor that isn't like a normal ODST's armor, it's actually a powered exosuit. Again, like I said, they're very, very rare. They pretty much only ever show up in Halo Wars 1 and 2, as well as a few of the Halo Waypoint Chronicles. Unfortunately, that's really all the information we have on them. They're just so rare. There is no actual verification that Noble Six is dead. Yes, there is, and it's shown to us pretty much immediately after his death. Catherine Halsey gives Noble Six's eulogy, and in it she says that his sacrifice led to Halo, that she is sad that he never got to see the fruits of his labor, that his body and armor belong to Reach and have burned to glass. Why would she have said any of this if he was still alive? And I know the 2 possibilities that you're thinking of. Either A, he's alive and is an Oni secret, but so is Halsey. In fact, the official story for Halsey was that she was killed on Reach as well. If anyone would know that he survived, it would probably be her, especially with her expertise in the Spartans. The other thing that you may be thinking is that he survived Reach's glassing and has been chilling out on the planet ever since. Then why haven't we found him yet? We have been back to Reach several times. A significant number of humans are on Reach as of current canon, trying to chip away the glass and make it livable again. When Blue Team was there, he would have shown up if he was alive. I even saw one guy say that his body isn't in this scene, so he must have gotten up and left. We see this scene through his visor, and then we're looking at his visor. So his body would be behind the camera, so to speak. We should just let the guy be dead. It's the whole point of his character, to sacrifice himself so that the original trilogy of games could happen. How could you torture an AI since they can't feel? That is a fantastic question. So while AIs can't feel like we can, they can still experience pain. They can experience every feeling and emotion that a human can because they fundamentally are human. Each human AI is made from a human brain. Pain is just brain signals through chemical processes. They can do the same with digital processes. But to answer your question more directly, we actually have a reference for how to torture an AI, as odd as that sounds. Because that's exactly what happened to Cortana, and the reason she's so broken and distraught in Halo 3. Because the Gravemind has been torturing her for weeks by the time the Master Chief gets to her. AIs have one thirst: knowledge. It's what they're made out of. It's what they crave. And in a short story called Human Weakness, we read about the Gravemind slowly chipping away at Cortana by tempting her with the insane amount of knowledge that he possessed. He slowly whittles down her self-confidence and even accesses her files, making her even more insecure about herself. He also shows her what it's like to be a human that is infected by the Flood. And since she is based on a human brain, she could be forced to relive these memories and almost feel what that Marine felt. But there is another surefire way to torture an AI. Poke it, prod it, and tease it with rampancy. The thing that no AI wants to think about, but once the idea is planted, they can't stop themselves from going over the process over and over and over in their head, or should I say core. Do we know the locations of all the Halos? It's hard to tell. Obviously, we know about Alpha Halo, Delta Halo, Epsilon Halo, and Zeta Halo. That's Installation 04, 05, 03, and 07 respectively, leaving 01, 02, and 06, which are called Beta Halo, Epsilon Halo, and Kappa Halo respectively. Which I've been getting this question a lot in my live streams about naming the Halos. Why are they named in such a way? The Installation 0 blank is the order at which they were created and left the Ark. Installation 01 being the first created, and Installation 07 being the last. The Greek alphabet names are the order in which they fire. For example, Alpha Halo would be the first to fire, but was the fourth to be created. Now, as far as I can remember, and as far as I can find, Installations 01, 02, and 06 have not been found by humans yet. There isn't a reference to humans or the Covenant finding them that I can remember or find, but that doesn't mean we haven't. Now, the Covenant has found them, as in they found the luminary that had all of the Halos locations. They just haven't gone there yet, or Covenant races haven't gone there after the fall of the Covenant. However, humans have been to the Ark, and we have studied it for a number of years, and there was probably a luminary there with the Halos locations. And just because we haven't heard of it doesn't mean that we haven't been there. It just means that it has yet to be revealed to us, which I understand is a very unfortunate answer, so I'll just say for now, with the information we have not found these three Halos. There's also the mystery Installation 09 that got sucked out of slipspace by a Guardian. We have yet to find any information about this as well. There isn't one homeworld for the Covenant, like there is one homeworld for humanity, since the Covenant was made up of individual alien races that all came from different planets. The Prophets fled from Janjar Kalm on the Forerunner Dreadnought, leaving behind a devastating civil war. They searched the stars and found the elites on a colony planet. After a long war, the Writ of Union was signed and the two species founded the Covenant. From here, they found many other species and forced them to join the Covenant as well. The Hunters on T, the Jackals on Ian, the Grunts on Balaho, and the Brutes on Doisek. Each one was discovered, more or less a war was fought, and then each one was brought into the fold after being beaten down. Basically, they would find them, there would be a war, they would either be forced to join or they would find a way to communicate, and then they would join. However, I suppose you could say that the Covenant's home planet was High Charity, the Covenant's mobile holy city. For all intents and purposes, it was their Earth. Heavily protected, constantly surveyed, and nearly impenetrable, unless, of course, you teleport inside of it. But High Charity wasn't always there. By the time the Writ of Union was signed, it was not even a thought. But after centuries of construction, High Charity became the surrogate homeworld of the Sanshayum after Janjar Kalm seemingly had been destroyed. I will never understand how people defend Dare's needless and dangerous secrecy. I made a video about Alpha 9 and their original mission, and some folks were trying to rationalize Dare's lack of communication. Maybe it was top secret, maybe it was the Oni stuff, things like that. And that stuff is objectively true, but let's actually play that out. Let's say the Solemn Penance doesn't jump into slip space here. That means there's no explosion. That means that the team lands where they're supposed to. They go underground and they find Virgil. In the best case scenario, the team finds out about Virgil anyway, because she's taking them there, without telling them what their mission was. They have to wander around all damn day looking for each other, and they still have no idea why the hell they're even there in the first place. The only reason this mission succeeds is because Buck has a random idea and goes back. There is literally no need for the secrecy if the team is going to find out anyway. If she just told the team the mission, a few things would happen. Firstly, they wouldn't have to drop immediately with the rest of the ODSTs attacking the Solemn Penance. They're not attacking the Solemn Penance. They don't have to drop here. So the drop is much smoother. And two, if something happens, like this, they know where to go and what they're there for. And she just keeps doing this stuff. For 2 whole books, she does the same stupid shit. She is by far my most hated character. How can you expect people to succeed in a mission when they don't even know what the mission is? Literally, this entire mission depends on Buck having a goddamn premonition from the precursors or some shit and coming back to save the day. It's insane. Did the Covenant have communication moles? Yes, they did, but it wouldn't have mattered for the mission that this refers to. She's speaking face-to-face with them, just tell them the mission. There's literally no way the Covenant can hack a face-to-face conversation. But on to the actual question, yes, the Covenant not only had ways to hack into human communications, but also had interpreters for those communications. Avimed Telkam was the leader of the Servants of the Abiding Truth until his untimely demise. But during the war, he learned several human languages, and his job was to intercept human transmissions and relay their meaning to the shipmasters and fleet masters above him. That being said, there were some communication networks that were more secure than others. For example, the Spartans' TeamSpeak was generally more secure than other frequencies. They'd still go in radio silent at some points, just in case the Covenant could listen in, but generally speaking, they were good to go. There was even a time when an undercover insurrectionist working as a bridge officer tried to get the Spartans killed. They were out in space trailing a Covenant ship for a dangerous mission where surprise was the name of the game, and while they were at a critical point in the mission, their comms lit up as an officer, quote-unquote, accidentally makes a transmission. He was doing so in hopes that the Covenant would pick up that there were humans around, find the Spartans, and kill them. Samuel has this very interesting dynamic of what could have been and his continued impact for what he did. For those of you who don't know, Samuel 034 was the first Spartan to be killed in the Human Covenant War. The first Spartan to be killed in combat, for that matter. And he had so much potential. He was the biggest and strongest Spartan at the age of 14. And we have Spartans like Kurt and George that were 8-foot-tall behemoths. And people like the Master Chief by no means was even close to the strongest Spartan, but even still held up a falling mountain with his legs. Could you imagine someone so much stronger than that? And what that Spartan could do? And then we have the other side of that coin, and that is what Sam actually did and its impacts. He was the first Spartan to die, but the Spartans still, to this day, credit Sam as being the one to show them that the Covenant could be killed. And if they could be killed, they could be beaten. How many times in the nearly 30-year war did the Spartans face nearly unwinnable situations, but Sam showed them that they could win, so they persevered. I'd say nearly every battle they went into had some aspect like that. Think about Chief being alone on Alpha Halo with the Covenant and the Flood bearing down on him. This is not a winnable situation 9 times out of 10, but he continued to fight. And he got out alive because Spartans don't quit. Sam's impact was immeasurable, but what he could have been also would have been grand. Isaac 039 is one of the more elusive Spartans. There isn't a lot known about him, unfortunately, but he is at a very key event. During the fall of Reach, he was assigned to Fred's Red Team, and as such was forced to ditch the Pelican and fall to the surface of the planet. This dislocated both of his arms, but he still continued to fight. On the planet, he was assigned to William's team, who was sent to Castle Base to secure the area in case Spartans needed somewhere to fall back to, something that was absolutely necessary. When the Spartans got into Castle Base, they found the Forerunner slipspace crystal that the Covenant had been looking so carefully for, and this is what alerted the Covenant to the Spartans' position. The Covenant invaded the base and tried to take the crystal, but the Spartans retreated down a narrow passageway, and Isaac and his friend Vin were ordered to hold back and defend the rear. They would fight the Covenant here until they decided to lay satchel charges and try to catch up to the other Spartans, but the charges detonated too early and the cave collapsed onto Isaac and Vin. They weren't able to be raised on comms, and they were assumed to be dead and listed as MIA. The Spartans left Reach when the chief returned to the planet, and many years later when Blue Team came back to Castle Base, there is no direct mention of Vin and Isaac, so they still lay under the mountain. Mendicant Bias was an unfathomable success for the Forerunners, but also their greatest loss. He was a contender-class AI, the Forerunners' most powerful AI at that point in their history, and he was created to organize the war effort against the Flood. But it would fall apart when he was given control of the 12 original Halos, and one was used on a planet called Charam Hakor, the old human empire's capital. And here, the Halos blast set something free. This something was brought onto one of the Halos where Mendicant Bias would interrogate it for many, many years, 43 years to be exact. Now, this thing was none other than the Primordial, and claimed to be the last precursor. For 43 years, Mendicant Bias thought he was working on the Primordial, but it was the other way around. The Primordial was able to turn Mendicant Bias against his creators. This culminated in him taking as many Halos as he could, attacking the Forerunner capital, and helping the Flood in the fight against the Forerunners. And then the Forerunners did something totally inadvisable, but brilliant. They tried again. They created another AI, this time a Medarch-class AI called Offensive Bias, who was tasked with working against Mendicant Bias and the Flood. And he would succeed. Now, these numbers may not be canon, but they're what I was able to find, and that Mendicant Bias had 4.8 million ships versus Offensive Bias's around 11,000. But during this battle, Halo fired, cleansing the galaxy, but also disabling Mendicant Bias's Flood-controlled ships. And in 2 minutes, Offensive Bias mercilessly ripped through Mendicant Bias's fleets, captured the AI, and brought him to the Ark for interrogation and, in some ways, death. When did humans learn of the Great Schism? That is a little complex. We know that the Great Schism officially starts on Delta Halo on November 3rd, 2552, but weeks earlier, on October 10th, 2552, Buck finds this and asks Dare, who says it's classified. Now, there is no canon explanation for this. There's a lot of online speculation, but there's no evidence to support any of the reasons I've seen online. The best that I could come up with is that the Brutes must have known that the schism was coming before it kicked off. They'd need to have time to prepare for such a thing, and the Brutes are a pretty impatient and in some ways dumb species a lot of the time. So if high-ranking Brutes knew that this was going to happen in the coming weeks, and elites started to get a little annoying, they may have jumped the gun. That doesn't, however, explain how Dare or the Office of Naval Intelligence even knew that this was happening. They'd either have had to intercept communications, which is totally possible, or the thing that I think is most likely to happen is they've seen something like this happen before. Oni probably noticed that Brutes were turning on the elites in small squabbles throughout the galaxy in the weeks leading up to the Great Schism. As far as humanity's response, however, it was quite legendary. People understood that there was no way they could win this war alone, and the Covenant's warrior species that were bred and built for war just got thrust out of the Covenant. So an uneasy alliance was formed to take down their common enemy and make sure that Halos didn't fire, something that the elites very recently learned was not a pathway to godhood. There was a human diplomatic team that was caught in a battle between two separate elite fleets and then a third brute fleet. Their leader, Melody, sent her team off of the ship to a planet called Caro. Now, that's a very interesting planet, and I'm going to make a video about it here in a couple days. But this left Melody basically alone in the heat of this losing battle. She had been on this ship for 2 months, building somewhat of a rapport with the shipmaster, who explains that this battle is lost and that warriors will soon board the ship. He offers to honorably execute her, but she refuses and thanks him for the offer. Instead, she wanted to do something unthinkable to the elites. Like I said, she had been on this ship for months at this point, and part of her mission was to recover 3 very valuable UNSC assets that the elites had recovered from the wreckage of a Nova-bombed and destroyed planet called Glyke. She wanted to wake the 3 cryogenically frozen Spartans of Grey Team. These elites did not want to do this, because they came from Glyke. Their home, their families, their keeps, they were all gone because of these 3 demons. The elites refused, even if these Spartans could turn the tide of this battle. The elites were more than happy to know that even if they lost, the Spartans would die with them. However, she fought back, freed the Spartans, and were able to evade capture. When an elite ship fights another elite ship in space, honor still reigns supreme. In ship combat, they are not trying to destroy the other ship, only disable it. They do this because fighting hand-to-hand, face-to-face, allows the loser to die with honor and the winner to triumph in honor. They would disable the other ship, then board. While the losing ship prepares to be boarded, anyone not able to fight would present themselves to the losing shipmaster to be honorably executed, denying the enemy a chance to dishonor them. Once the winning ship boarded, the fight continued inside until the shipmaster of the losing side was killed, or until they were able to repel and kill the boarding party. In very, very rare cases, when the boarded ship prevailed, they may be able to make some sort of counterattack and take the other ship, or they may try to make repairs, or they may abandon their ship outright. But it is worth mentioning that this isn't a universal thing. It was only typical in fights between two elite ships, and even when two elite fleets would go against each other, smaller ships may be blown up or destroyed just out of convenience. And it didn't matter if they were fighting humans or brutes or any other race. Those ships would be destroyed without really a second thought, unless those ships had something on it that they really wanted. I love brute combat so much because they take their ground fighting philosophies and just multiply it times 100 for ship combat. Most ships will try to strike a balance between maneuverability, armor, and firepower. It's a beautiful dance of taking hits when necessary and trusting your whole armor and shielding, dodging ships when necessary, and dealing as much damage as possible. But the brutes just take one of those three very critical criteria and throw it out the window to bolster the other two. Something that is baffling to both humans and elites. They load up their ships with as much armor and weaponry as possible, making their ships super heavy, or I guess massive I should say, in space, requiring a lot of power to move them, especially in combat maneuvers. So they just don't move them. They plant their ships smack dab in the middle of a battle, and with their insane amounts of armor, they just tank enemy shots. And while they sit there unmoving in the context of the battle, they deal out insane amounts of damage with their weaponry. But there's another aspect of this that we have all seen in Halo Infinite. Since their ships are so insanely armored and so insanely heavy, they also like to use them as weapons themselves, ramming into enemy ships and plowing through them. Now, other races ram as well, but it's typically a last-ditch effort that will not only cripple your own ship, but may also outright destroy it. But to the brutes, it's just good, clean fun. One of the most interesting planets in Halo is a place called Cairo. The reason it's so interesting is because it was once a human colony that was either evacuated or attacked by the Covenant. I think it's a combination of the both, but it's not really clear what the history is there. But what is clear is that the colony that was on this planet now sits as a ghost town. This colony was called Soraka. When the elites learned of the lies of the prophets, they returned to Cairo to give it a new name, Rakoi, to honor the humans that died unjustly in the war. More specifically, these elites came here after their homes were destroyed by Grey Team in the Nova bombing of Glyke. The elites also created their own colony called Rak, again in honor of the human colony that was once there. This planet is also where the elusive species called the Sharkoi were, and the item that controlled them called the Vertex. This is where a brute named Hakabe raised the Sharkoi in an attempt to seize power in the post-war galaxy. Luckily, though, humans and elites were able to stop him. In the modern Halo canon, the planet is a joint elite and human colony in something called the Joint Occupied Zone, or JOZ, which is an area in space that is jointly held by both UNSC, but also various races of the Covenant. Typically the elites, but also grunts, jackals, and brutes have also been known to live in this area of space. There's this really funny scene in Halo Envoy when a human is stuck on an elite ship that is being boarded, and she goes to get weapons. She walks into the weapons bay where the weapons master is there arming Sangheili warriors getting ready to fight, and she says that she intends to fight as well. These are male elites, 7, 8, 9 feet tall, and this small human woman is demanding to be armed. The arms master at first refuses, citing that she was not allowed weapons when she came aboard the ship, but she fights back. She says that things have changed and that she is now forced to stand and fight with these elites against the boarding party. She tells the elite that she may not have had the right to bring a weapon onto the ship, but now she has the right to defend herself and prove her honor, playing on the elite's sense of honor, and she tells this elite to call the shipmaster if he thought that it was that important. She then decides to put her shoulder down and shove past this elite, massive alien that probably quadruples her in weight. She's able to get past him, and in her mind she is ready for an energy sword to slice her head off, but it didn't come. Her speech seems to have worked, and she stuffs her pockets with plasma grenades, which are massive, so she's only able to fit one in each pocket. She then grabbed a jackal shield gauntlet and a plasma pistol, and after an elite told her that it's a tiny gun for a tiny person, she left and went on her way to release 3 Spartans from cryo. What was the Master Chief doing for the majority of the war? Trying desperately to slow down the Covenant, and in most cases, failing. He nuked Covenant cities, he nuked Covenant ships, he nuked human cities with Covenant inside of them. He fought on the front lines and saved as many people as he could, but in the end, almost every planet that he and his legendary blue team fought to save was glassed anyway. I think we very often lose sight of the reality of the human Covenant war, since we play in the closing days where so much changed so quickly. But for the vast majority of the war, it was loss after loss. To humanity, the glassing of a colony was a devastating loss, and to the Covenant, it was Tuesday. The Master Chief and the other Spartans, for that matter, spent 30 years doing everything in their power to slow down the Covenant, to evacuate civilians, to learn what the Covenant wanted, and in most cases, no matter what they did, the colony was glassed anyway. So much so, in fact, that the Master Chief started to force himself to watch. We read about this in The Fall of Reach, where the Master Chief asks a ship captain to stay in system a little bit longer so that he could watch a planet get glassed. So he could sear this image into his mind to remind himself why he's fighting so hard and so often, because failure was so catastrophic, and they really didn't even need to fail. They may be sent on a mission that they're successful in completing, and still the planet could get glassed anyway. When Grey Team awoke from their cryogenic slumber, what they found totally baffled them. Grey Team went into cryosleep under the understanding that the human Covenant war was still going, and going poorly. Their latest information is that Reach had fallen, and the Covenant had found Earth. They're awoken by a human envoy on a Covenant ship that had been injured and had fallen unconscious from her wounds. So these 3 Spartans wake up in a Covenant ship that they didn't go to sleep on, with a wounded civilian with them. To them, the war is still on. They had no idea that the war had ended and that some elites were now friendly. And they had no idea why they were on a Covenant ship, and they look over their cryo containers readout, and they learn that they've been in cryo for 5 years and 8 months. They work on the woman with biofoam, and Michael is able to hack into the ship's systems by literally plugging wires from the ship into his armor. And what he learned, again, confused the hell out of him. They were on a Covenant ship that was being attacked and boarded by another Covenant ship and Covenant soldiers. Now, what was actually happening was the ship was being attacked by a rival, something that wasn't uncommon in the post-war galaxy, but Grey Team didn't know any of this, and they were completely bewildered. Why doesn't this Pelican have a damn slip space drive? I know what you're thinking. Most Pelicans don't have slip space drives, and you're very, very correct in that. And as Esparza says here, typically Condors would be the dropships with slip space drives. But, and this is a very big but, I just got done reading the Kilo 5 trilogy, as many of you may be aware, and during the Kilo 5 trilogy, 2 Pelicans are fitted with slip space drives, and one of them was fitted with such a slip space drive on the Infinity itself. After the war, the UNSC got engineers by both rescuing them from the Covenant, but also from a place called Trevelyan. And while the team is on the Infinity, for a very, very brief amount of time, I should add, their Pelican is given a slip space drive by those engineers. So while I was playing through this recently, the thought crossed my mind as to why haven't all Pelicans on the Infinity been given slip space capabilities? Well, I think probably it would be cost. As Carter so elegantly put, slip space drives are the single most expensive pieces of equipment in human existence, and they'd have to be made for the engineers to fit them into the Pelicans. However, maybe Esparza just got unlucky here. Maybe the Pelican he chose was one of the Pelicans that wasn't able to get fitted with a slip space drive, and there are in fact other Pelicans on the Infinity that had slip space drives, just not all of them. Why did I refer to Janjar Kham as being seemingly destroyed rather than outright gone? That's a fantastic question. Janjar Kham is the Prophet's homeworld, and according to them, was destroyed when the sun exploded. So why would I say seemingly? It really just comes down to the Prophet's track record with the truth. When the Prophets learned of the nature of humanity and their rightful and inherited place in the galaxy, they lied to the Covenant and covered it up. When the Prophets learned about the truth of Halo, they lied about it to the Covenant and covered it up. The Prophets have a long and fruitful track record when it comes to lying to the Covenant in order to hold on to power, and that basically puts every claim they've made into question. Everything they prop themselves up on is either an outright lie, a mistranslation, or miscommunication. And when it comes to the destruction of their homeworld, it has to be questioned. Now, Janjar-Kom very well could be, and probably in all honesty is, gone. There is no evidence to suggest the contrary, and typically, if someone asked me this on a live stream and I gave a simple answer, I would say it's gone. But it's just like when you had that friend in high school that was a pathological liar. Every day they had some elaborate story, and soon you stop trusting that person, even if what they're saying in that moment is objectively true, because so much of what they said is complete bullshit. It's the same principle for the prophets. How did the citizenry react to the loss of Halo? It was devastating. The loss of Halo was absolutely unthinkable. The Covenant had been searching for Halo for basically their entire history. For 3,000 years, generation after generation grew up, lived, and died, all working towards finding Halo and bolstering the Covenant. And they finally found one. 3 days later, it was gone. Even if we forget about the long history of trying to find Halo and just focus on the religious aspects of it, it's again devastating. The Covenant always saw Halo as these immortal pieces of Forerunner legacy that would lead them to godhood. Nothing could destroy one, and yet humanity did. This would be like if the Vatican or Mecca was nuked. For those religions who hold those places holy, it's completely unthinkable. But there is one solemn penance here, and that is the solemn penance. When the shock and grief about Halo ripped through the Covenant, the solemn penance was already headed toward the Ark in their minds. They were actually headed to Earth to find the Ark's portal. When that plan failed, the backup plan was Delta Halo. So while Alpha Halo was a devastating loss, and in a lot of ways ended up breaking the Covenant, they didn't have to wait long before the joy of finding a new one hit the Covenant again. Can an AI be made from another species' brain? Absolutely they can, and that's exactly how Iritus was made. A company named Lux Veluspa that specialized in the creation of human smart AIs has started experimenting with smart AIs based on the brains of other species. The only example we have at this date would be Iritus. Now, it is a common misconception that Iritus is a banished-made AI, and that's not the case. He is a human smart AI that was made from the brain of a brute. So can an AI be made from another species' brain? Yes, they can. Now, Iritus specifically was made at the Lux Veluspa facility, and then was stolen by the Banished. He was taken to a planet called Camber, where he assisted the Banished in shipbreaking operations. 2 Spartans, Eklund and Din, were dispatched to Camber and were able to lock Iritus down inside of Din's neural interface. They brought him back to the Avery J. Johnson Academy of Military Science, and this is where we get Halo Infinite's multiplayer story from. It's unclear, however, at this point if Lux Veluspa is still in action and if they're still making AIs from other species' brains. With how Iritus turned out, however, I wouldn't be surprised if they aren't allowed to do this again. An elite-brained AI would probably become a really big problem for both the UNSC, but also for the UNSC's alliance for the Swords of Sanghelios. Is Avumed Telkam a bad guy? That's a really fantastic question. For those of you who may not know, Avumed Telkam was an elite that, after the fall of the Covenant, still believed in the Forerunner's godhood, and as such believed the Arbiter was unfit for leadership. Not because he worked with humanity, not because he led the elites against the Covenant and the Prophets, but simply because he no longer believed in the Forerunners being gods. So what he did was start purchasing arms from the Office of Naval Intelligence and basically started the elite civil war called the Blooding Years. Now to us, a guy that plunges a planet and a species into a civil war because a leader doesn't follow the same religion as him could be seen as a bad guy. But really to the elites, everything Telkam did is totally within his rights. In elite culture, war, assassination, death, these are all things that are almost normal and customary, especially for those in leadership. Telkam also gave his word that he would leave humanity alone once the Arbiter was dealt with. So was Telkam a bad guy? For the elites, not really. For humanity, not really. In all honesty, most of what he did was totally within his rights, and would be expected of any elite that felt so strongly towards a leader. What is something that is mentioned once, but that is super interesting and needs expanded on? For me, it's something called a death vow. Now, this is something that the Covenant had, more specifically and typically it was the elites. If the elite was given a mission, they may take a death vow. This means that they have already committed their entire life and death to this mission. And since they've already committed their entire life to this mission, death is not something to be feared, because his life has already been sacrificed for this mission. Sort of a circular logic. I've already sacrificed my life for this mission, whether or not I'm already dead. So I might as well give everything to this mission. And this is not something that is only for the elites. Other races of the Covenant can make a death vow as well. The way I like to think about this is the Arbiter in Halo 2. He tells Urtos that his life doesn't matter to him either. He's sort of shamed and downtrodden. His life doesn't matter to him because at this time, his life has already been sacrificed for the cause, the entire point of being an Arbiter at that time. The only time we really ever see this is in a book called Silent Storm, when an elite watches a human defuse a nuke in such a calm manner that it makes the elite think that maybe humans also had a death vow. Yeah, the Master Chief leg presses a mountain. In Halo Shadows of Reach, the Master Chief really shows his raw strength. He does two pretty insane things in this book. One of them is when he and Kelly are deep in the rubble of the destroyed castle base. While they're crawling through the wreckage, the tunnel that they're in starts to collapse. So he and Kelly get into position and they leg press the mountain up. And while the Chief holds this section of the tunnel stable, Kelly goes deeper into the facility, retrieving the item that they were looking for, a cryogenic container holding a cloned copy of Dr. Halsey's brain. This would later go on to create joy in Halo Infinite. The other insane feat of strength that the Master Chief has here is when he and Blue Team are fighting the Banished, who have come to Reach in order to open a portal to the Ark to help Aatrox, who is still at the Ark at this time. In fact, this is how he leaves the Ark and comes back to the galaxy. And the Chief, during this fight, punches a Banshee with such force that it goes flying off into the distance. And this really isn't something that's special for the Spartans. They punch holes through Covenant armor plating fairly regularly. When they're on Reach and have to climb a vertical surface, they just punch and kick their own hand and footholds. Sam uses a concrete block as a punching bag. When I was a kid, I thought it was so silly that the Prophet of Regret would die to being punched in the face by the Master Chief, but in reality, the fact that Regret survives one punch at all is kind of a miracle. Ensign Lovell was one of my favorite characters, and his death still devastates me. He was an up-and-coming officer with a promising career ahead of him, but a few transfers, a few insubordination claims, and an unfortunate incident with an admiral's daughter, he got demoted back to ensign and was put on a dead-end backwater assignment as a slipspace probe officer. He would send probes into slipspace, retrieve them when they dropped out, and this is how the UNSC sort of checked if anything was coming via slipspace. He saw something coming towards Sigma Octanus 4, and he sent out the report. Keyes would get this report and realize that the Covenant was on its way. The only reason he would realize this is because the Spartan washout Fahajad had become a slipspace expert and had written a paper about how some things in slipspace may appear as one solid mass but can be smaller things just very tightly packed together. Keyes realized that it was a Covenant fleet heading to Sigma Octanus. This is when he would perform the legendary Keyes loop, but one of his bridge crew would break during this daring maneuver, almost inciting a mutiny, at least trying to. This officer was kicked out, and Keyes decided to have Lovell join his crew on the Iroquois, where he would perform brilliantly. When Keyes took command of the Pillar of Autumn, his bridge crew would follow him, and again, Ensign Lovell would perform brilliantly in his tasks. Then came Alpha Halo. The bridge crew ditched the Pillar of Autumn and made their way across the surface of the ring. An officer named Ellen Dowski kept suggesting surrender, and so finally they just let her. They tied her up and left her for the Covenant to find. The Covenant did in fact find her, and she led them to Keyes and the bridge crew, and they systematically and brutally executed every single one of them, including Lovell, Dowski, and Lieutenant Hakawa. But they took Keyes and brought him to the Truth and Reconciliation. Where is June when Halsey gets rescued by Chief on Reach? He should be there with the other Spartans, right? That's a fantastic question, and you're absolutely right. The problem with June is that he hadn't even been a thought when the Fall of Reach came out. And when Bungie made Halo Reach, they just screwed up a bunch of the Fall of Reach. That really is the problem. We know from First Strike and the Fall of Reach how Halsey and a bunch of other Spartans got off Reach, but in Halo Reach, she goes with June. Now we know that June takes her to Castle Base after leaving the underground facility beneath Sword Base. In a Halo Waypoint update, we learn that June was tasked with evacuating other personnel from Castle Base to safety, where he took them, and if safety means off-planet, that's unknown. And how he himself got off the planet, that is also unknown. There is a common explanation that he climbed a slipspace elevator to get off the planet, and while that is super awesome, super cool, that is not canon. By September 7th, when the Master Chief returns to Reach, Halsey blows up Castle Base, and the Spartans leave, we really have no idea where June is. What is clear, however, is that he somehow did escape Reach, and after the war went on to become the recruiter for the Spartan 4 program. What happened to the Anodyne Spirit after Halo 3? That is a fantastic question. After the Forerunner key ship, or Forerunner Dreadnought, or its proper name, the Anodyne Spirit, went through the slip space portal to the Ark, it would automatically land on the Ark. The Covenant did not initiate this process. Mendicant Bias's fragment that was on the ship did. From here, the majority of the Covenant's forces left the ship to take part in the battle to come. But some stayed behind, and some would later return when the Flood arrived to the Ark. Now, it is important to mention that some Forerunner structures are able to shield those inside of it from Halo's deadly pulse. So when the Master Chief lit the unfinished Installation 08 above the Ark, the Covenant forces inside the Anodyne Spirit survived, and they were stranded on the Ark when the portal closed. So the Covenant forces left behind would stay here for around 7 years on the ship, around the ship, following Truth's instructions to keep the ship safe and guarded. That is until the Banished arrived on the Ark. The Banished would attack the ship looking for the shards of the Forerunner Slipspace Crystal, the same Forerunner Slipspace Crystal taken from Reach and First Strike. All of that is to say, the ship on High Charity that started the Covenant, that went to Earth and opened the portal, it is still, in modern day canon, sitting at the Ark. How did the Master Chief see and hear Cortana and the Gravemind in Halo 3? This one's a bit tough. There are two possibilities. Both are explained in lore. The first one and simplest one is that these are echoes of Cortana's personality matrix that were left behind in the Master Chief's armor when she stays on High Charity. The Master Chief actually has his armor checked over for this, and this is the explanation that the Mjolnir technicians come up with. The other possibility is that they are messages from Cortana, but more likely the Gravemind. How could this be? Well, in a short story called Human Weakness, we learn that the Gravemind toyed with Cortana, even being able to enter her code and mimic her voice and form. And again, I know this is quite an explanation here. I think it is possible that this isn't Cortana at all. It is possible that this is the Gravemind using Cortana's form and voice to convince the Master Chief, along with Cortana's message that came from High Charity, to enter the portal and go to the Ark. How could the Gravemind have sent these messages? He's a god. That's really the long and short of it. Almost any question that has ever come up that involves the Gravemind is explained by him not playing by the normal rules of the galaxy. He is, for all intents and purposes, the last precursor in the galaxy, not the universe, but definitely the galaxy. Now, there are some examples of precursor-like technologies and precursor-like behaviors, but those are, for the most part, small instances. It is possible that there are other precursors in the galaxy, but not as active as him. So for the most part, he's the last ancient god of this galaxy, and so the rules just don't apply to him in a lot of ways. After Grey Team awoke from cryosleep, they pretty much immediately perform one of the most grueling feats of endurance in the Halo universe, but it's not even something that was hard for them. When they land, their human envoy gives them a bit of information. She's injured, and the team will need food and water and supplies. So the envoy suggests a Oni station in the northern reaches of the mountain range that they landed in, Gila Station. The problem was that it was really far away. So Grey Team makes a stretcher out of some branches. Mike and Jai carry the envoy while Adriana covers their tracks from behind. Now, we aren't specifically told how far this run is, but it had to have been over 100 kilometers. And I say that because after traveling for a little bit, they have to deal with a Banshee before continuing. And this is where they mention that they still have 96 kilometers to go to reach their location. So Grey Team, after just having been awoken from a nearly 7-year-long slumber, run over 100 kilometers while carrying an injured woman, with no food, no water, or breaks. And they almost do it out of defiance. Jai mentions that it reminds him of training, how Mendez used to make Grey Team do this sort of thing and how they would do it and then do more, do extra, just to spite Mendez. They went on a 500-kilometer run in 3 days, carrying each other when they got tired. So while this mission was a huge feat of endurance in itself, they've done it on a grander scale just to show Mendez that they could. What's the process for colonizing for humanity? That's a fantastic question, and it's a long and complex process. First, they'd have to find a suitable world, or one that was close enough to being suitable for human life in order to terraform it. Now, human terraforming didn't have the capability of, turning an extremely hostile environment into a place that you could live in. But we could nudge the planet's environment to where it was compatible with human life if it was close enough already. So, for instance, the moon has been heavily colonized, but they live in habitats. The entire moon has not been made livable. But planets like Reach are completely livable to humans after some light terraforming. And terraforming can mean many things. In some cases, and I swear this is true, we would huck asteroids at the planet to make a new crust. In some cases, we would huck huge chunks of ice at the planet to make lakes and oceans. That's the sort of brute force terraforming we're talking about, not the Superman movie level of terraforming where devices can change the entire planet. So, for example, there was a planet called Biko with a moon called Saoba. Saoba was an ice planet, and Biko needed ice and water. So, we mined the ice, loaded it into Mac cannons, and launched the huge chunks of ice from Saoba into Biko's atmosphere, where it would burn up and slowly over time change the planet's ecosystem to be compatible with human life. Once the planet is habitable, we can start building. Mining can start, farming and agriculture, civilians can move in, start working and stake their claim, and start their new life. As far as who would go to these planets, as far as I understand, whoever could go. If you wanted to move to a colony world and you had the means to do so, you totally could. Harvest, for example, was full of old American farmers. Gray Team used a Nova bomb to destroy an elite planet called Glyke, but when they did it, they were cut off from UNSC communications and had to decide for themselves whether or not they should go through with it. The decision was made by a vote, and the vote was probably unanimous. At least that's what makes sense for following procedure, but problems arose right after the bomb went off. The team watched as the planet broke into smaller chunks, killing every single living being in an instant. Seeing this destruction, even against an enemy, gave the Spartans pause. Adriana wondered where the armor stopped and the human inside began. Michael was tired of being used as a weapon over and over again for 30 years. And their problems didn't just come from retrospection, but also from timing. Gray Team was always deep behind enemy lines. That was the point of the team. Doing missions where UNSC help was never a guarantee. But their long-range communication equipment had gone down. It was damaged. So when they decided to light the Nova bomb on the last day of 2552, they simply didn't know that the war had ended. They didn't know that the elites allied with humanity when the Great Schism kicked off, and they didn't know that we would not have survived without the elites. With that, and seeing this planet break up and shatter, learning that they did it to an ally years later, put considerable strain on the Spartans. Human peace efforts after the war have to be some of the most impressive stories of willpower in the Halo universe. A human envoy tells an elite fleet master her experiences. She was in Africa when the Covenant attacked, how afterward there wasn't enough food or water and not nearly enough medicine to go around. She talks about how she listened to a child cough every night until the coughing stopped, and she talks about how she was glad at the burial because the child would no longer be in pain. She tells the elite that for years she woke up in the night in a cold sweat listening for Covenant ships, fearing that they would come back. She says that the demons in her dreams are elites, firing boiling hot plasma into crowds of civilians while they run for safety. When she closes her eyes, her nightmares look like elites. And this would have been nearly universal for so many humans. For 30 years, the Covenant was an evil, creeping closer and closer, killing billions. And yet, even with all of that history and trauma, humans have tried tirelessly to create peace between themselves and the elites. And it had to be hard for those in the thick of it negotiating these peace deals throughout the galaxy, to look up at these aliens who you hated with every fiber of your being and promising them that you won't attack. If humans weren't reclaimers, would we join the Covenant? Honestly, no. The way that other races join the Covenant isn't really a nice time. Typically, they'd fight with the Covenant until they couldn't fight anymore, and then they'd join. Or they'd already have a common basis in worshipping the Forerunners as gods, so joining them was somewhat natural. When it came to humans, we didn't worship the Forerunners, and we barely knew what they were, especially in the early days of the war. We knew basically nothing about them. But it's also just kind of human nature that we wouldn't bend to the Covenant's will. If the Covenant came with peace terms and told us that every human in existence would now be subservient to the Covenant, I just don't see humans going along with it. It almost certainly would have changed the war. We'd probably have a lot more knowledge about the Covenant than we did during the war, which was not a lot. We may have better strategies, but I just don't see Hood and Parengoski signing over humanity to the Covenant. We probably would have still fought against it as hard as we did for the War of Annihilation anyway. It was already a losing fight until the very end. The real difference would have come when we went to Halo and the Ark, and the Covenant just wouldn't have a way to light them if we weren't reclaimers. That would be a huge difference, but as far as joining, I just don't think humanity would go with it. Does the Didact have a family outside of the Librarian? Yes, he does, and it's one of my favorite Halo topics. He had a mother and a father that were sentenced and executed for basically rebelling against the Builder class in a rebellion called the Cradal Conflicts. His mother was one of the greatest warriors in Forerunner history, and his father incited something called the 12 Laws of Making and Moving, its upper and lower tenets, and the rules of virtue. This basically started the rebellion. Once the the rebellion was quelled, however, the Didact watched as his parents were executed with something called a suppressor, a device that left nothing behind, no essence for the domain. In other words, they were denied an afterlife. From here, the Didact's memories were wiped and he was given the name Shadow of Sundered Star. Later on, he would meet the librarian. He would also meet another warrior servant, which he had a romantic relationship with, but he would ultimately marry the librarian, and they would have several children. Unfortunately, however, all of the children would be killed in the war against humanity. We get glimpses of them, like how they were burned alive in their armor on Charm Hakor, or in the battles leading up to Charm Hakor, and this really fuels the Didact's rage and hatred toward humanity to another level. However, when the children are killed, the librarian does something kind of weird. She captured her children's essences, which is the thing that would be put into the domain, and she puts them into Forerunner constructs and places them on Earth. When the Didact is exiled from the Ecumane for refusing to quit working on the Shield World and submit to the Halo plan, he is stuck inside a cryptum and sent to Earth, where the robotic forms of his children sort of become his guards until Bornsteller comes and sets him free. Can another High Charity be built? Possibly yes, but probably not. There isn't any one faction in the galaxy at this point in current canon that is powerful enough to do something like High Charity. Since the Covenant fell into a ton of smaller factions, the combined power, both militarily but also in terms of like wealth and infrastructure that the Covenant had, just has not been matched. Think of like the United States, a very powerful country. If the federal government ceased to exist and each state became an independent country, the no longer United States wouldn't be nearly as powerful as America has been in the past, especially if those states start warring against each other like the ex-Covenant factions did. It's also important to remember that High Charity was built around the Forerunner Dreadnought. It supplied a large amount of power, not all of it, but a great deal of it, to the space station. And with it stuck on the Ark, High Charity would be a lot more difficult to build and power. Again, like I said, this is not to say it is impossible. Some factions have grown to be very, very powerful and very, very wealthy. The Banished, Dova Nestos Covenant, these are factions that could make a mobile base, that could be grand, but in my opinion, they wouldn't be nearly as big and as extravagant as High Charity. Humanity, for all intents and purposes, kind of did build their own High Charity in the Infinity, the UNSC's flagship. It was the pinnacle of human engineering and budget, and we all know how that turned out. Are all of the generations of Spartan augmentations the same? No. Each generation was augmented differently, but the end product is very similar between generations. When the Spartan 2s were augmented, this was on the cutting edge of medical technology, and as such, it was pretty crude. For their augmentations, they were literally cut open and torn into. Ceramics grafted to their bones, a thyroid implant, nervous system rewire, increased blood flow to the retina, and there's more to it, but you get the point. They were physically cut open to add these things. Spartan 3s, in my opinion, had it a lot nicer. The Spartan 3 program's whole point was to produce more Spartans and to do so with less money. And as such, the bulk of their augmentations were given through injections. They got ceramic bone grafts, muscle enhancements, retina enhancements, and reaction time enhancements via injections. The Gamma Company Spartan 3s also got their brain screwed up through injections as well. Now, they were still surgically operated on for various smaller things, but for the most part, the augmentations were administered through injections, so it wasn't nearly as violent as the Spartan 2 augmentations. Spartan 4s, however, go back to having it pretty rough. They're adults, so their bodies are less accepting of change, so surgery was back on the menu. Their bones were physically lengthened and hardened, their joints replaced because simple movements with their new muscles and bones could just rip a joint out of its socket. Pretty much all of their organs, save for the brain, were replaced with synthetic organs or augmented in some way. They undergo gene therapy and some other treatments as well. In short, each Spartan generation had their own augmentation process, but what came out the other side were all Spartans of very similar capabilities. What happened to the Shadow of Intent? That is a fantastic question. The ship, the crew, and its shipmaster have been pretty busy in the post-war galaxy, with the Civil War looming over Sanghelios and the ship being the only CAS-class carrier in the Arbiter's fleet. The Arbiter told Ertos to take it away from Sanghelios so it couldn't be damaged in the upcoming battles, but also because it was a very powerful ship, and the Arbiter knew Ertos to be loyal, while others on Sanghelios may not be as loyal. Ertos would take the ship to the outer reaches of the galaxy looking for surviving Sanchayum, the race of the prophets, and judging them. them. Now, we don't know a whole lot of details on this process, but not all Sanshayum wanted the elites to be ousted from the Covenant, and it seems that Urtas isn't just killing everyone that he ran into, but actually hearing their stories and doing what he felt was just. This would lead him to a prelate named Tembatek and a former Covenant minister, the Minister of Preparation, who attempted to seize the ship and kill Urtas and the crew. Luckily, it didn't work. After this, the ship continued the pursuit of the Sanshayum, and this would lead them to Dovonesto, who would lead them to the Banished and the Created. This led to a joint UNSC and Swords of Sanghelios task force to deal with all of these emerging threats, and Spartan Grey Team would join them. Who is Dovonesto? That is a fantastic and complex question. Dovonesto is an odd guy who is shadowed in secrecy. He was a Sanshayum who belonged to an elusive sect of the Covenant called the Order of Restoration. Think of like the Illuminati for us or something like that. This was a secret organization of powerful prophets that were secretly controlling the political scene of High Charity. So while he was never made High Prophet, it is very likely that he was influencing the High Prophets directly. While still in the Covenant, he would become a mentor to a young brute named Severin. Now, it's not super important at this point in the story, but it would become important much later on when Severin's father becomes chieftain of the Brutes, Tartarus. Now, after the fall of the Covenant, the Order of Restoration's name starts to actually make sense. Very basically, they were trying to rebuild the Covenant, which isn't a very unique plan as like a dozen other factions try to do the same thing. But the difference here is that Dovonesto had a plant in the Banished, Severin, who was given control of the entire Banished, save the fleet that went to Zeta Halo, and he had another plant, Selenion, who created his own fairly powerful ex-Covenant faction. Now, Severin would stop following Dovonesto during the battle for the Lithos, and Selenion would be killed. So Dovonesto would take Sele's Covenant and flee, looking for another way to harness the power of the Guardians. He seems to be heading to a place called Cloister, which is where many surviving Sanshayum are said to be, and what Urtas has been looking for nearly a decade at this point. Also, I apologize for my voice. I just got back from a week-long trip out in Phoenix. It was a great time, but my voice is very, very damaged from screaming my head off at medieval times. If you haven't been, you should go. It's a lot of fun. How long can each generation of Spartan live if they don't get killed in combat? Unfortunately, we don't know yet. The Spartan 2s are about 50 years old, 49 to 50. The surviving Spartan 3s are very, very young, other than June, who's a little bit older, and the Spartan 4s can range anywhere from mid-20s all the way up to their 40s and 50s. Simply not enough time has passed for us to get a concrete answer on this question, but there has been speculation on the topic. Spartan 4s particularly have mostly synthetic organs that theoretically could be swapped out like parts on a car. So there's really no telling how long they could live for as long as their brain stayed healthy. But here is something of note. Buck was fighting the Covenant since around the time Palmer was born. He got his augmentations much later in his life, and so I think it would stand to reason that he'd have a shorter lifespan than someone like Palmer, who got their augmentations way earlier in their life compared to Buck. There are also theories that Spartans can live to 100 years, 150 years, even 200 years, but that is theory and speculation, and we really have no concrete evidence to back that up, other than like a sentence or two in the Spartan Field Guide, which they don't have concrete evidence to back that up because we haven't gotten there yet. There just simply has not been a Spartan to make it that long because time just hasn't progressed that much. There's also the issue of cryosleep. Cryo halts the aging process. So again, using Buck as an example, due to cryosleep, he has no idea how old he actually is. He could count the years to his birthday, but he has no clue how old he actually physically is. So unfortunately, at this point, there's really no way to tell. Survival mode in Spartan armor is really quite a recent development in Halo canon. It only came around in the newest edition of the Mjolnir platform, the Mjolnir Gen 3. If a Spartan sustains a life-threatening injury, the armor steps into action, and a few things happen pretty quickly. If warranted, the Spartan can be put into a medically induced coma. This slows breathing, it slows the heart rate, and it slows brain function. During the duration of the coma, a nutrient-dense slurry is fed to them, giving them the calories they need to both stay alive, but also heal them during this process. But their healing would be helped along as well. If the suit is punctured, as it pretty often is in these life-threatening scenarios, the suit can rebuild itself, for lack of a better term. Using nanotechnology, it can close that puncture and seal those important things inside the body. And as for the injury itself, it depends on what the injury is. The suit can automatically inject biofoam into an area, closing a wound. The suit can also start healing the Spartan and even accelerate that healing through nanotechnology. We've seen this get used a few times in Halo lore. A Spartan named Horvath gets stabbed with a shard of Forerunner alloy, and his suit seals itself and stitches Horvath back together. This is also how the Master Chief survived 6 months in space, something that would have been impossible with previous platforms of Mjolnir. The previous versions didn't have this feature, and only about 90 minutes of breathable air. So if this happened in this armor or this armor, the Chief would have simply suffocated to death if his brain injury didn't kill him first. If the Master Chief made it back to Earth at the end of Halo 3, could he have retired? So here's the thing about Spartans and retirement, and it's a pretty common misconception. A lot of people think that Spartans are exceptionally expensive assets to the UNSC, and as such aren't allowed to take a step back and retire or leave the service. And while that is true that billions have been poured into each Spartan, it is simply not the case that they cannot retire. We have examples of 2 Spartans retiring, and we have probably the biggest and best example of a Spartan being able to retire in Naomi, when her father demands that her retirement be an option to her in exchange for a Covenant ship he had purchased. This is after the war when the Covenant fleet had broken up. He was able to purchase a Covenant ship in order to use against Earth to find answers for his daughter, and this was part of that bargaining. Now, the future head of Oni informed him that she, Naomi, just like any other Spartan for that matter, can put in her retirement papers and leave the service at any time just like anyone else. What's even more interesting is that after the war, the UNSC kind of gave everyone the opportunity to retire if they wanted to, making Mickey's betrayal one of the dumbest decisions a character's ever made, in my opinion. So to answer your question, the Master Chief could have retired if he came to Earth. He could have retired at any time if he wanted to after he was found, or even in the last few years of canon. But if we listen to what he says in Halo Infinite, it's clear that he doesn't want to. The fight is all he knows. It's what he's good at. It's where he can make a significant difference for humans everywhere. And so he stays. What kept humans fighting for so long if we were getting our butts kicked so brutally? There are 2 ways I can take this question, so I'll just answer them both. What kept humans fighting? Simply survival. We didn't really have a choice in the matter. An alien empire was burning our worlds and steadily moving closer to Earth. We could either roll over and take it or fight, and humans will always choose to fight. But how did humans keep the war effort alive for so long? Well, there are a few reasons. Firstly, space is really, really big, and the Covenant didn't know where human worlds were, so they'd have to scour each system looking for humans in order to do anything. Some human worlds just got lucky and were never even touched by the Covenant. In terms of resources, humanity had a lot of planets, especially during the early stages of the war. It dwindled down as we got closer and closer to Earth, but still, when one planet fell, the others could pick up the slack. It also helped that humanity's war manufacturing happened on core worlds: Earth, Mars, Luna, Reach. These planets would produce the bulk of the human war goods, and luckily they were the last to be affected by the Covenant. There's also the issue of recruitment and morale, and the UNSC and ONI strategically did things to boost fleet morale. One example is the declassification of the Spartans and the publication of their wins. That was a huge boost to human confidence and morale. It showed that the human race had human heroes that were taking the fight to the Covenant and actually winning. Were there any non-military personnel that lived on High Charity? Absolutely there was. High Charity is a super interesting thing for the Covenant because it was a Covenant mobile base that was insanely protected and insanely strong militarily speaking, but there were also aliens there that really had nothing to do with the Covenant's military. While a lot of the Covenant there was military, it wasn't everyone. There would be business people and chefs and drivers and logistics workers, accountants. I know that it's kind of silly to think about, but High Charity was really just a city, and any city is going to have people who aren't working in the military. At the top, there were politicians and counselors, their assistants, their clerical workers, all of these things that would help them, and then at the bottom, there were manual labor workers and things like that. There's this really great short story called The Shadow of Intent that shows the celebration the city went through when a female Sanshayum had a baby. Since the race of the prophets had such low birth rates, there were celebrations and festivals when one was born in the city. There were fireworks and food vendors and salespeople and decorations and all of these sort of mundane things that we could see in our day-to-day life in a big city that we really don't think about when it comes to the Covenant. So to answer your question, yes, High Charity was first and foremost a military hub, but all military hubs and bases have civilians working in them to support the military personnel, and High Charity was no different. And that completely leaves out the enormous religious aspect of the city where every member of the Covenant was supposed to make a pilgrimage to the city at least once in their life. There would be a huge infrastructure set up to support that. How did Halsey react to the deaths of Jacob Keyes and Miranda Keyes? That's a fantastic question, and both of them are pretty devastating to Halsey, but in different ways. For Jacob Keyes, obviously, she had affection for him. She had a child with him. But after they split up, she kept up with his career, and obviously he was chosen for Red Flag. And then he dies one of the most painful, horrific, and brutal deaths imaginable. We read about her learning about this in First Strike. She reads John's mission report about the Battle of Alpha Halo and the Flood, and this floored her to learn both that Keyes was dead, but also the manner in which he died. For Miranda Keyes, it's a little bit different. The way she learned of Jacob's death was through Chief and his mission report. The way she learns of her daughter's death is almost done out of malice. Not almost, it just straight up is malicious. After Halsey and the surviving Spartans were taken from the remains of Onyx, now called Trevelyan, she is arrested and put into a room where the head of Oni, Parangoski, debriefs her. Before she does this, however, she tells Osmond that she has the pleasure of telling Halsey that her daughter was killed. Debrief is a nice way of putting it, by the way. It was a grilling. Parangoski berated her for kidnapping Kelly, for the clones of the Spartan 2 program, and for the program itself. And then she goes, oh yeah, by the way, your daughter's dead. This is particularly painful for Halsey because she never wanted Miranda to join the military. Miranda sort of rebelled against her mother in joining the military and trying to follow her father's footsteps. Halsey knew what this war was, and she didn't want Miranda involved in it, and she was right, and her daughter was killed. There's later sections of the Kilo 5 trilogy after this grilling happens where Black Box reports that Halsey stays in her cell alone, crying over Miranda's death. Do the Spartan 2s have any odd feelings about Chief's cryosleep? Not really. Firstly, it's not something that Spartans would really even care about. They'd just be glad that their friend, their brother, is still alive. But if you actually look at the surviving Spartan 2s, Chief's slumber really isn't that unique. In fact, it's the shortest of the extended cryosleep freezes. As we all know, the Master Chief was in cryo for 4 years and 7 months, if I remember correctly, after Halo 3 leading into Halo 4, but Grey Team was forced to go into cryosleep after their ship was damaged in the Nova bombing of Glyke. They stay in cryo for 5 years and 9 months, if I remember correctly. Most of the time they just rounded up to 6 years. So a little while longer than the Master Chief, but then of course we have Red Team, who was frozen for nearly 30 years, 28 years to be exact. Of course the other Spartans didn't know about Red Team's situation, but if you tally up the surviving Spartan 2s, we get basically half of them that have been forced into cryosleep for these extended periods of time waiting for rescue. And the other Spartans really wouldn't care that these Spartans were younger than them physically. They'd just be happy that their brothers and sisters are still alive fighting for humanity. However, I do think there's a caveat here where if the Spirit of Fire finds its way back to the galaxy, there certainly would be some shock as Red Team shows up as 20-year-olds and the other Spartans are in their mid-40s to 50. But I think that shock would wear off rather quickly when they learn that their brothers and sister that have been missing, presumed dead for 30 years, are actually alive and have been fighting the Banished. Was Sergeant Johnson augmented by the time of Contact Harvest? Yes, he was. The Orion program is shrouded in secrecy not only in universe but also out of it as well. As in, we don't know a whole lot about the program. We don't know all of the people who went through it. We don't know a whole lot about the augmentations. We have like some basic explanations, and we don't know much about the training either, but we do know about the timing. The Orion program first started way before Johnson was even born, like over 100 years before he was born. This was the first phase of the program that only lasted about 10 years and was shut down. When Johnson was a young adult, however, near the turn of the century, the program came back in its second phase. This phase of the program ran from 2491 to 2506, and sometime in between those years is when Johnson, Byrne, James, and Octavio, as well as many others, would receive their augmentations. They underwent gene therapy to improve their cognitive abilities. They had some bone reinforcements and a splash of human growth hormone. In other words, they were stronger and smarter than your average human, but not even close to a Spartan. They would come about a decade later on. Well, the program would start about a decade later. With this timing, it is very clear that Johnson went AWOL in Chicago and was sent to Harvest, already having had his augmentations, and that would no doubt help him survive the next 28 years of war, where he witnessed the beginning, literally the very beginning, and the very end. Halsey didn't even care about her daughter. I understand why you would think that, but that's not really the case. It's very common for folks to think that because Miranda was raised by her father, because she took her father's name, because Halsey went to work on the Spartan 2 program, and some comments made by other characters about how Halsey shipped her imperfect daughter off and replaced her with 75 genetically perfect kids, that she didn't care about Miranda. I totally see that. But the thing is, Halsey knew what she was. Halsey was a doctor as a teenager and the youngest Oni doctor in history. She was brutally efficient and emotionally extremely cold. She knew this, and she talked about how she didn't want to have an abortion when she and Keyes had an accidental pregnancy, and she gave motherhood a chance. Not many people know, both in and out of universe, that Miranda was born and lived the first few years of her life as Miranda Halsey, not Miranda Keyes, and lived with her mother. But again, Halsey knew what she was. She knew she was not going to be a good mother, and she knew that she was not going to improve. She knew that she had work to do, and that work was exceedingly important. While she was coming to all of these realizations, the man who fathered Miranda, Jacob Keyes, had a stable job in a stable location. He was on Luna at the UNSC OCS school, working as an instructor for up-and-coming officers. He wasn't out in the galaxy fighting at that point. And she also knew that Jacob would love and care for Miranda far better than she ever could have. So really, in my opinion, the best thing that Halsey could have done was actually what happened, sending Miranda to live with her father, who she knew was a better parent, who was in a more stable situation, and even though Miranda would come to resent her mother for this, it was the best choice. Who made Helioscrill and why? That's a fantastic question. Helioscrill is a very unique armor. There have been elite-made armors for Spartans since then, but typically these are done with the involvement of the UNSC or their supply contractors. Helioscrill, however, is different. It was made by a master artisan who wanted to test her skill against the best of human creations. Not only was it armor, but it was also meant to be a work of art. This elite was able to craft the armor and even reverse engineer the neural interface to make it compatible with Spartans in the first place. Now, we don't know a whole lot about that. We don't know how she pulled this off, how she got the Mjolnir information to make this possible, but what we do know is that it was manufactured by the Kolar Manufactorum, which was an arms manufacturer in the very powerful state of Vidam on Sang Helios, the state that the Arbiter is Kaidan of. So I think it would stand to reason that he had some influence over how this armor came into existence. But the Kolar Manufactorum didn't only make this armor, they also made the Thermalian armor, which was made for Spartans that were working with the swords of Sang Helios. They also made phantoms and frigates and some other things like that. Pretty cool stuff. Did the Spartans try to defend Halsey when Oni arrested her? Absolutely they did, and it ends up being one ODST standing against 4 Spartans. So an Oni team called Kilo 5 were the ones to arrest Halsey. They brought her blue team, which was Kelly, Linda, Fred, as well as a few Spartan 3s, and Mendez onto the ship called the Port Stanley. When they go there, the team puts Halsey into a cell, and their commander, Saren Osman, orders an ODST named Vaz to guard the door. And as he's doing this, just standing on guard duty, he hears the heavy footsteps of Mjolnir walking toward him. His teammate, Spartan 2 Naomi, wanted into the room to talk with Halsey, but Vaz was under strict orders to not allow this to happen. And as he's having this conversation with Naomi, Fred, Kelly, and Linda come up behind her, all 4 Spartans wanting to either let Halsey free or just to speak with her. Now, like I said, Vaz was just an ODST. A very good soldier, but just a regular guy. There was absolutely nothing he could have done if a single Spartan wanted to get past him, let alone 4 of them. 4 of the best of them at that. Again, he explains that he is under strict orders not to allow any Spartan into the cell, and luckily the Spartans don't try to force their way in. And to get to the question at hand, Fred says that he'll take it up with Parangoski. Now, we don't know how this conversation went, but presumably the highest ranking Spartan 2, the leader of Blue Team at that time, went to talk to the Commander-in-Chief of the Office of Naval Intelligence to try to defend Halsey in some way. Obviously, that didn't work, though. What was the first Forerunner artifact that humanity ever discovered? That is a very difficult question. We know that humans knew next to nothing about the Forerunners up until the closing days of the war, but I think I've narrowed it down to 2 possible answers. In Ghosts of Onyx, we learn that the planet of Onyx was discovered in 2491, and that an area that is later known as Zone 67 was discovered on Onyx in 2511. Now, what Zone 67 actually was a huge Forerunner city stationed on the Shield world that humanity would call Onyx. The Office of Naval Intelligence closed this area off and started excavating. As far as what was actually found here and studied, we don't really know, but I think there is one thing that could have possibly been found before 2511, and that's the Forerunner artifact that the Master Chief finds in Côte d'Azur. On Sigma Octanus 4, the Master Chief and the Spartans go down to basically nuke a city, but they notice that the Covenant had particularly been interested in a human museum, which struck them as weird because the Covenant never really seemed to be interested in human history. They go inside. This is actually their first encounter with with a hunter ever, but they see the Covenant looking after this stone. Now, it would later be revealed that this is basically a map to Halo with some other information. We just didn't know it yet, but since it was in a museum, albeit in 2552, I think it may have been discovered before 2511. Who is the brute that challenged the Master Chief to a duel on the Ark? This has to be one of my favorite optional things in a video game that people completely miss if they don't do the thing you're supposed to do, which is easy to not do. His name is Cathegis, and he was actually trying to become the next Tartarus. After Tartarus was killed by the Arbiter and Johnson on Delta Halo, a massive vacancy was left at the top of the Brute leadership. Cathegis was a high-ranking Brute that sought to fill those shoes. Or pause, I guess. Like I said, Cathegis was already a very high-ranking Brute, and as such, he and his pack were among those lucky enough to be brought to the Ark, and he was in constant communication with the Prophet of Truth. He was tasked to kill the Chief, or at least slow him down, so he sent stalkers out, but while the Chief was working through them, Truth ordered Cathegis to kill the demon himself after he left the Ark's cartographer. So he regrouped with his pack, who formed this half-circle. Cathegis believed that if he was the one to kill the demon, he would have been elevated to Tartarus' position, Chieftain of the Brutes. Now, if you go down here and just start attacking the Brutes, they'll fight back. However, if you stand and fight Cathegis alone, the Brutes have been ordered to allow this duel, this one-on-one, to proceed uninterrupted, only stepping in once the Chief kills Cathegis. What books are best to read? That's a fantastic question. I know you're seeing my face. It's weird. I'm going to give you 5 books that I think really every Halo fan should at least try. And then after that, I'm going to give you a couple books that you could skip. But starting off with the ones that everyone should read, it's the OG, it's The Fall of Reach. This has fantastic information about it. It's going to tell you about the Spartan program, the Spartan 2 program to be specific. It's going to tell you about Operation Red Flag. It's going to tell you about the Covenant War. It's going to tell you about Captain Keyes and the Keyes Loop, and it sets up Halo CE. It's a fantastic book, and every Halo fan, I think, should absolutely go and read this one. When you're done with that, and you want to know more about how the Human Covenant War actually started, then there is no better source than Contact Harvest. What this does is it has Covenant perspective, and it shows us the inner workings of the Covenant, how the 3 high prophets that are in the games, how they actually got to that position of power. And it shows really just why the Human Covenant War started, which is really fantastic information. If you want to know about Spartan 3s, then Ghosts of Onyx is going to be your friend here. You're going to learn about the Spartan 3 augmentations, and then of course you're going to learn about Onyx, which is super interesting. Finally, we're going to get into some more recent things here. So those are setting up the universe. Those are setting up established things that have been established for 20 years, right? These are going to be more recent things. And they're really big deals. Cortana deletes herself, and there's no other book that explains it better than Epitaph. Now, I know that sounds weird because Epitaph is about the didact in the domain, but he actually has conversations with Cortana in this book. It's just a really good book. It's not that long. It is fun to read. You learn a lot about the didact without having to read the Forerunner trilogy, which we'll talk about in a second. And it tells us how and why Cortana is no longer in the universe. Next is my favorite Halo book, which is Rubicon Protocol. This is what is happening on the ring, Zeta Halo, in those 6 months where the Master Chief is floating out in space. This talks about surviving Spartans from the Infinity, having to fight the Banished. This is one of the more emotional books that I've ever read, and its sort of sequel, Edge of Dawn, is really good as well, so I would highly recommend this if you want to know more in those 6 months of Halo Infinite. Now, some books that you might not want to read or really don't have to read, unless you're really into ancient lore and Forerunner lore, you can skip the Forerunner trilogy. Cryptum is awesome, Silentium's pretty good, Primordium, in my opinion, sucks. Primordium is 500 pages of a dude walking. And unless you're really into Halo 3's plot, but again, and way worse, you can skip Hunters in the Dark. Probably one of the worst books ever created. It's a Halo book, and so I have to read it, and I have to kind of like it, but man, it's tough to read. Anyway, those are some books you should read and not read. Love you. Insurgents being on Reach isn't just shocking to learn to the Halo community, but also shocking to the leadership of the UNSC. The thing that is misleading about the insurrection is that we typically say it's an outer colony problem, and not something that core worlds would have to deal with. But that simply is not the case. It certainly is more of a problem in the outer colonies, but it was also on the core worlds as well. And them being on Reach was no accident or coincidence. If the insurgents can live on the UNSC's fortress world, They can also strike the UNSC's fortress world. But here's the thing, by the time Halo Reach happens, the insurrection has severely slowed down. For a few reasons. Like I said, the insurrection was a much bigger issue in the outer colonies, and for most of the war, the outer colonies were the ones being glassed. This cut the insurrection's head off the snake, so to speak. Their leadership was in shambles, their supply lines were cut off, and when there was one entity that was capable of actually fighting the Covenant and slowing them down, or distract them and even send them in the wrong direction, why would you hit them at home? Sure, the innies on Reach could have hit the UNSC with a devastating blow, but why? It would hurt the UNSC and by extension hurt the entire human race's chance to survive. But even after the war, innies find a way to bend the truth and blame the UNSC so they can start their pointless war again. Innies are the dumbest thing in Halo. And I don't mean like their existence is dumb for Halo to have. I mean, their characters are the dumbest people in Halo. Was Côte du Jour really the first time Spartans saw a hunter? That was pretty late in the war, right? I'm going to blow your mind a little bit further. Spartans hadn't even seen an elite until 2552 either. So this is just a problem with the early books. Bungie was horrible about keeping canon straight and didn't really care about the books, so a ton of it has been retconned since. If you have only read the early editions of The Fall of Reach, you'd think that Spartans had never seen a hunter or an elite or a brute until the later months of 2552. That has since been retconned, and we know they've been fighting these aliens as early as 2525, which was basically the very beginning of the war. However, I think the context of a story is very important. So when I talk about The Fall of Reach and about how the Spartans had never seen an elite before or how Reach fell in a matter of hours, I say that because that's the context in which these characters saw it and felt it, even though it's been retconned later in the series and is no longer canon. But in my opinion, the feeling of those Spartans looking over this towering monster in a museum in Côte du Jour, that raw emotion of fighting this impossible beast, is worth mentioning, even if it's not really the first time they're seeing this in canon, and they may have killed hundreds or thousands. Context in the stories matter to me, and to be true to the book that I'm using as a source, sometimes I'll include those details even if it's not exactly canon anymore.